Thank you very much, Jay. And as I said, I have a written talk here, which I imagine partly because I was thinking of posting it later on, and I guess it's being recorded as well. Um, the first thing I would do is just to maybe change the title a little bit. When I was talking with Jay, and then he suggested Kindleberger as a money viewer, and I've now changed it to Kindleberger was a money viewer. Okay, so it's a small change, one little W, but it shifts the meaning sort of interestingly. Um, for the last several years, as Jay says, more or less since the MOOC aired in the fall of 2013, I've been working on this fourth book, an intellectual biography of Charles P. Kindleberger. Jay told me that what inspired this talk that some of you have been wondering why I'm doing such a thing, and you're puzzled about what it has to do with the MOOC or the money view more broadly. Have I abandoned this, or what is it? I guess for most of you, it's not the obvious next step. And at one level, maybe that's the point. It seemed to me that a lot of people were building on the MOOC in a lot of interesting ways and doing fine without my help. And now I'm 61. No point in competing with the young who have more energy, more time, and they have careers to build. So let them do it. And in that regard, I'm looking forward to hearing what you've done with all of this in the next couple of days. But I wasn't just avoiding competition with you guys. I was also positively continuing my own intellectual journey. In the new Lombard Street, which, as Jay says, was published in 2011, I had used the money view to make sense of the history of the Fed from its founding in 2013 and continuing up to the global financial crisis of 2008 and 9. I was and am pretty happy with that book, but when it was done, I realized it had a big hole. Namely, it was domestic, and it missed the rise of the dollar to dominance as global money, and that was a keyhole because, of course, that's exactly why the global financial crisis was global, because the dollar is global money. So I set to work writing another book with the one that I'm doing now, focused on the dollar, not on the Fed. I wasn't very far along in that before I found Charlie and realized that I could hang the entire story on him. Very much the way Charlie, that's Charlie Kindleberger, everyone called him Charlie. You'll hear me calling him Charlie. I call him Charlie in the book all the time. Very much the way I had hung the story of the rise of modern finance on Fisher Black. Everyone called him Fisher, actually. So that's what I've been doing ever since, retelling New Lombard Street from an international standpoint through the life and times of Charles Kindleberger. The new book is a biography of the dollar and the story of the development of specifically international monetary economics. It's about the making of the global dollar system and the making of our understanding of that system. So that's by way of introduction. From the first, and this is one of the reasons I really chose this way of telling the story, from the first I felt an affinity with Charlie. One reason, he's very much a product of the American institutionalist tradition that I traced in my very first book, The Money Interest and the Public Interest. Earning his PhD from Columbia University in 1937, Charlie grew up in a department dominated by Wesley Clare Mitchell. I don't know if people know who he is, but he was the major American institutionalist. His main teachers, however, were H. Parker Willis at the business school and James Angel in the economics department. Parker Willis had been very important in creating the Federal Reserve, and Angel was a favorite student of Alan Young at Harvard, and Young had been the first subject of my first book. So, and I had even considered Angel as a second subject, and thought that was less interesting, and so I did in fact Alvin Hansen instead. But the point is here that I knew where Charlie was coming from, and I had even met him because when I was doing a Hansen, I went to visit him in his retirement community because he had two or three articles with Hansen before World War II, and so I got his reminiscences of his teacher. In the beginning of the book, I trace this intellectual heritage in some detail as a background for appreciating Charlie's work, and in particular his dissertation, which was published as International Short-Term Capital Movements in 1937. As Charlie was finishing this book, he was working at the New York Fed. He started there in October of 1936. That's where he came into contact with John H. Williams and with Williams' key currency ideas. Mostly the contact was indirect, filtered through his colleague Emile Dupre, who had been Williams' student at Harvard. The most immediately important influence in 36 was the tripartite agreement to stabilize the dollar pound franc nexus. The idea was to stabilize the core of the system, of the international monetary system, as the first step toward getting back to something resembling the pre-World War I international gold standard that had been built around the pound sterling. One of Charlie's duties at the Fed was to track the operations of that nascent system, and this work led to his first major academic publication, Speculation and Foreign Exchange, in 1939 in the Journal of Political Economy. I draw attention to these early works, the dissertation and the article, because in them we already see Charlie espousing what I have come to consider the central themes of the money view, namely the centrality of one, the survival constraint, and two, the dealer function. Specifically, his dissertation was about the role of credit as a substitute for gold in meeting the national survival constraint, which is to say the balance of payments. And his article was about the exchange dealers who facilitate that short-term capital flow for a profit. In both respects, Charlie was a money viewer from the get-go. And now I'm going to share my screen and just show you the charts from that. This is the two charts that are in that paper. And if you can read them, let me just make that a little bigger by running it. There. You can read the first one there is spot rates and forward positions. That's spot rates, spot exchange rates. And he's tracking measures of the forward positions of New York banks and others between the pound sterling and the dollar, and between the French franc and the guilder, Netherlands guilder. Those are and the right-hand one is interest rates in these different countries and forward rates in these different countries and movements of short-term banking funds. So he is in fact watching the process of stabilization, and you can sort of see there that there is a close, that covered interest parity is basically keeping the pound sterling and the dollar on track with each other, but not the French franc or the guilder, okay? Because there's just not the banking apparatus, the dealer apparatus is not doing that. So we're starting with sterling and the dollar, and that was his job to gather these numbers and to make these charts. Okay, so this reminds me very much of these charts that have been floating around about the FX swap basis, for example, okay, that was very key in the COVID crisis and also the global financial crisis. And I know we're going to be hearing about that from Professor Chéng tomorrow. So just, you know, he's there already in 1939. I don't know who drew his charts. You know, I think it was a lot harder to create charts like that back then than it is now. Okay. So let me proceed now. So that's 1939. That's where Charlie started. And I want to insist that this starting point set the course of his thinking from then on. Okay. But war intervened, and then post-war service in the State Department. So it was not until 1948, 10 years later, when he took his first academic job at MIT. It was not until then that he was able to return to these topics, and by then, the world had changed. Not only were capital markets, both short and long term, essentially shut down, but also the Keynesian revolution in macroeconomics had pushed questions of money to the side. In that new emerging orthodoxy, the balance of payments was understood not as a survival constraint in the payment system, but rather as an input to national income determination, with export surplus adding to income and import surplus subtracting from income. Y equals C plus I plus G plus X minus M. Notwithstanding the changed climate, the actual financial climate and intellectual climate, Charlie's first book at MIT, called The Dollar Shortage, 1950, quite clearly hews to the older way of thinking. It's a defense of the Marshall Plan as a way to relax the excessive discipline of the survival constraint that was then confronting Europe. By that time, this way of thinking was very much in the minority already and becoming more so every year. In the book, I tell the story of Charlie's subsequent efforts to influence policy debate, ranged mainly against Robert Triffin and his so-called dilemma, and also the story of his efforts to sway academic thinking, where he was ranging mainly against Harry Johnson's version of the monetary approach to the balance of payments. None of these efforts came to very much, however, and increasingly he found himself on the fringes of the profession and also of the department that he had helped to build. From this point of view, we can understand Charlie's late life shift to economic history as a way of reclaiming the old thinking on which he had grown up and bringing it to the attention of modern economists who had lost this essential perspective in his view. In this regard, I draw your attention. Now, some of these books you know, The World in Depression, Manias and Panics and Crashes, Financial History of Western Europe. Those are the three big books that I want to talk about here. Money View thinking features centrally in The World in Depression, which is one reason people didn't understand it. In Charlie's telling, the key mechanism underlying the Great Depression was the failure of the dealer system in traded commodities, which resulted in a very rapid price decline in those commodities, which undermined the balance of payments of commodity exporters and then reverberated around the world, forcing exchange depreciation. Okay, that's the first shock. The devaluation of sterling in September 1931 amounted to a second global shock, nothing less than the end of the key currency sterling standard, which had been cobbled together after World War I in an effort to reconstruct pre-war institutional patterns. With no international lender of last resort, the depression widened, deepened, and lengthened. Now, World in Depression, the book, was intended to counter the monetarist account of Friedman and Schwartz in 1963, who had argued that the Fed caused the Great Depression by bad monetary policy. Having demolished that claim, okay, as he certainly thought he had done, and asserted instead his alternative money view of the matter, Charlie might well have rested on his laurels since he was facing mandatory retirement in 1976. The book was published in 73. Instead, the success of this project seems to have given him the idea that he might be able to use comparative economic history more generally, not only to test other modern a priori theories, as he called them, but also to identify general patterns that could provide solid foundations on which to build a more satisfactory economics, more satisfactory because more solidly attached to reality, echoing Jay's opening remarks. Just so Manias, Panics, and Crashes was quite explicitly an attempt to revive an older tradition in economic thought that had emphasized the instability of credit. Hyman Minsky enters Charlie's account as a lineal descendant, that's what he calls him, of that older tradition. But the central point of the book is the tradition, not Minsky's specific model. Subsequently, A Financial History of Western Europe, published in '84, took on an even wider and more ambitious scope, plumbing economic history before 1914 in an attempt to derive theory that could then be used to make sense of economic events since 1914. In that book, Charlie tackles not only money, but also banking and finance. In his 1991 autobiography, he calls the book his chef-d'oeuvre. In my view, we need to take that claim seriously. The book is not so much a conventional work of economic history as it is Charlie's culminating treatise on international money. Perhaps I'm the first one to read it that way. I'm determined not to be the last. How am I doing on time here? Okay, I think I'm good. Let me take a sip. I've often said that the money view is a natural way of thinking for people who live in banks and central banks, as Charlie did for a while. Outside that world, however, the money view seems always to have been a minority view, especially in economics, which is resolutely abstracted from money, not only since World War II, but even before. In the Kindleberger project, and also in my previous books, I've used the history of thought to find intellectual ancestors on whom I could build, and that's been the main thing for me. But I have also used the history of thought to try to understand why academic economics developed as it did, and in particular, why it has so resolutely abstracted from money. Charlie had views on that question. In Manias, Panics, and Crashes, he blames the non-monetary Keynesianism of Alvin Hansen, the Keynesian cross, the victory of which left a vacuum into which the monetarism of Friedman subsequently expanded. There's more to the story than that, in my opinion, but that's a matter for another time. For now, suffice it to say that was the state of affairs when I started to study money 40 years ago, and I determined to find a different road. 30 years later, the result of those efforts finally saw the light of day in the MOOC, and now 10 years after the MOOC, and with the help of Charlie Kindleberger, I'm fleshing out the international dimensions of the money view. It's been a long road. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how the MOOC developed. Looking back, it's something of a puzzle. Why, given how naturally the Kindleberger story follows after my very first book, why didn't I continue on with Kindleberger? I had even met him. Instead, I carried the narrative forward with my little article on Hyman Minsky. The timing was driven by Minsky's death in 1996. He is very much a fourth subject in the Young, Hansen, Shaw line. Maybe if that book is ever reprinted, I'll make them add it as an appendix. After that, in the Fisher-Black book, I spent several years coming to grips with modern finance, which, just like economics, also tends to abstract from money. When the Fisher-Black book came out, some people drew the conclusion that I had abandoned money and moved on to finance, which is where the money is, I guess, in another sense of the word. But that's just because all the work on what would become the MOOC was happening in the classroom and wasn't yet visible in any publications. The privilege of tenure and the requirements of a teaching day job made such a long-term intellectual project possible. I'm particularly emphasizing that for the young scholars. This is the problem. How can you do a project that takes 15 years, okay, after tenure? 15 years I taught that course before anyone except the students realized what I was doing. So the MOOC was a big surprise to everyone, seemingly coming out of nowhere. 22 60-minute lectures, dropped onto the web. And people have been digesting it ever since. Minsky was where I started, but not where I finished. Indeed, the MOOC, it's important to emphasize, mostly grew out of Marcia Stigham's Money Markets, which is very much focused on US markets. That's why the MOOC also really lacks an international dimension. I'm going to try to fix that later. But it's important to appreciate that in reading Stigam, I was quite consciously copying what I had come to understand was Minsky's own method of self-education. He had the Mark Twain Bank and the Daily Financial Press. I had Marcia Stigam and also the Financial Times. What I did not realize until Charlie told me was that Marcia Stigam had been his student at MIT. So you see, all roads lead to Charlie. The road I took was definitely circuitous. Finally, I got there. Once I found my footing in the money markets with the help of Stigam, extension of the Money View to capital markets seemed like the most important next step. With the help of Fisher-Black, I was already quite far along that path when the global financial crisis hit, which explains why I could write New Lombard Street so quickly. The later chapters in that book simply summarize material that had already been developed at greater length in the course, as you've seen the course realize. For present purposes, the important point to emphasize is that the extension of the Money View to foreign exchange came later. Indeed, the FX lectures in the MOOC were very much still a work in progress at the moment of their filming. I was worried about that, as a matter of fact. I had not yet found Kindleberger, so those lectures were built instead on the books of David DeRosa. He was my Stigam for foreign exchange markets. It was only after New Lombard Street and the MOOC that I began work on Kindleberger. It was a circuitous journey, but I learned something important at each stage. From Minsky, I learned about the survival constraint. And from Fisher-Black, I learned about Jack Traynor and the dealer model. The important point is that both of these learnings were necessary in order to understand exchange rates, especially the FX swaps that play such an important role in knitting together the global dollar system today, the system that Charlie saw coming 50 years ago. Okay, in closing, I say that Charlie saw the dollar system coming. And if I had understood what he was trying to tell me back then, I might have saved myself 40 years. My margin notes on a financial history of Western Europe record that I read that book in December 1986, shortly after it came out, when I was at the Brookings Institution finishing up my PhD thesis. There's a lot of underlining in that book, so I definitely read it, but apparently I didn't understand it, which is why I have had to find my own way, as I have recounted. As for what Charlie saw coming, here he is in a speech he gave at the Boston Fed in 1970. A speech given at a time when he was still working on The World in Depression, probably with the idea that the book would be his culminating work, and certainly with no idea of the coming August 1971 Nixon devaluation of the dollar, or the 1973 resort to floating rates, but with a remarkably prescient sense of the forces at play. And here's my second little slide. So let me share again. Let's just read this together. He says, I believe that the dollar system could be an efficient way to run the international monetary mechanism suitably adjusted so as to diffuse decision-making authority widely. I doubt that we have the political will to achieve such a system. If the world, including the United States, so fails to understand the system as to prevent it from working, he's speaking of the economists here, okay, Triffin and others, or if US leadership capacity weakens, here he's speaking of Kennedy and Johnson, and makes room for the rise of other financial centers of dominance, the world will have an uneasy few years, he warns. This is a speech at the Boston Fed in 1970. And so it did have some uneasy years. I didn't hear the speech. I was 11, okay, at the time. But the next decade of the 70s was probably what made me into an economist, made me want to be an economist. I wanted to understand what forces had upended my family fortunes. And so I became an economist and began my intellectual journey and my effort to distill the money view from the wisdom of my ancestors. When I say that Kindleberger was a money viewer, my main purpose is to claim him as one of those ancestors and to honor him for his efforts, pushing forward the project that was his life's work, a project that has also become my life's work and maybe now yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Perry. I would like to now hand it over to Céline and then Eric to provide their comments. And you can see that many of us are clapping. Please feel free, as we're speaking, to use the clap function, the reaction function. It's the most effective way we can interact in this online space. But now, over to Céline.
Yes, hello, good morning, good afternoon, everyone. It's my pleasure to be here with you today. Thank you very much, Perry, for your speech. It is nice to hear about what you have been working on after your great MOOC, which I keep listening back to as I evolve intellectually and professionally over the years. Indeed, there were some concepts I did not grasp at first while taking the MOOC the first time, and in my professional life, I learned about things which brought me back to the MOOC on a regular basis. So thank you. I was a bit surprised to hear that you think that your MOOC mainly focused on national money and not so much on international money, because this is not really what I might take away from your MOOC. So in this regard, I would be curious to know what you have learned with Kindleberger on international money. And perhaps you could elaborate maybe on the main themes that you touch upon in your speech. And they're big themes, so please feel free to answer whatever you want, because we could take hours talking about this. So the two themes I identified were first, the rise of the US dollar as the world currency, and second, the governance of the global financial system. Regarding the rise of the US dollar as world currency, well, how did it happen? So I am also a reader of Kindleberger a little bit. I've read a couple of his essays and read his famous book, Manias, Panics and Crashes. And in one of his essays, The Politics of International Money and World Language, written in 1967, he mentions that the selection of the dollar as the lingua franca of international monetary arrangements is not the work of men, but of circumstances, by stressing the important fact that the dollar has grown out of day-to-day life of markets, i.e. that the dollar became the international currency not as a result of a political push, which was somewhat came also as a surprise to me, because I tend to read things politically, but it would be nice for you to elaborate on whether you agree with Kindleberger's point of view or not. And following that question, well, the other theme comes naturally. What would, good governance of the global financial system look like? So the issue today is that we have a national currency that the US dollar that is used as the international currency, and that the central bank in charge of that national currency has a national mandate and not an international one, which leads sometimes to instability or even resentment. So either we give an international mandate to that central bank, or an alternative would be to create an international currency that would not be a national one and that would be managed by a global entity. Today, the closest thing we have to this is the SDR, but the way the SDR was designed does not adequately address the problem of creating elasticity when needed. At the time of the MOOC, you mentioned the banker plan as an example of a balanced mechanism of international liquidity provision. What is Kindleberger's view on that? Does Kindleberger have an alternative proposal? In the essay I mentioned earlier, it seems like Kindleberger doubts on the effective use of an international currency that would be just created because it would be out of touch with markets, just as Esperanto has not been picked up as the international language. In any case, it seems that the creation of an international currency at this stage would require the support of the US, and I'm wondering whether that would be in their interest. And with that, I conclude my remarks, and I leave the floor to Eric.
Thank you. So does Perry want to reply now, or should I continue, Jay? I go on.
I think it's better if we first hear the discussion points and then go into overall discussion, and Perry can take the questions afterwards.
Very nice. Perry. So thank you very much for having me here. Thank you very much to Perry for all his work and for this discussion of Kindleberger. I would say personally, I'm very happy that that Perry is engaging with the work of Kindleberger. As an economic historian, I mean, Kindleberger's work is extremely valuable. I mean, should not be emphasized enough. That is someone who has made a tremendous contribution. And I think that also, as a contemporary economist, when he was writing in the 1940s, 1950s, 1960s about the time being, about the period he was observing, is also extremely valuable. And that's what Perry is showing here. And I think that my experience as an economic historian working on this period is that it's you learn so much from Kindleberger when he's describing the international monetary system, all the international flows happening in the 1950s, also the Marshall Plan, the Bretton Woods period. Well, when you compare this approach to many approaches of his contemporary fellows, which are trying to build models, statistics, which are now completely old-fashioned, and you cannot get anything from these papers. And when you compare this to the papers that Kindleberger wrote at the same time, the difference is really striking. So I think it's really someone who really needs to be interpreted and analyzed as Perry is doing. So I really welcome, and I'm looking forward to this book. So as Perry has said, Kindleberger was an American institutionalist, and in this way very close to the European tradition of political economy of the 19th century, both the German school or also the way that, for example, English economists wrote about monetary affairs in the 19th century. So in that way, it's not surprising that he's close to the money view, because it's really as a money view as Perry is showing. I mean, it's really start from the actual functioning of money market and the monetary system. So there's always a very precise descriptions of the monetary mechanisms of the interlinkages between the different financial institutions, and something that you find in all his work. So definitely, when you compare Kindleberger to the other authors of the time, of Friedman and Johnson and so on, so the difference is striking, is the way that he's really putting forward first the actual functioning of the monetary system. Then what is more striking in that way, that was also very different from another fellow, another contemporary economist that you mentioned, was Robert Triffin. And in many ways, actually, Robert Triffin and Charles Kindleberger had a similar background, a similar experience working at the Fed in the 1940s. They had quite a similar approach to the international monetary system. As you said, they do not immediately endorse the national accounting view of post-World War II. They were both of them were focusing on the international capital flows and so on. So in many ways, you could see them as quite comparable, except that they diverge a lot on the political view of the international monetary system in the 1950s and 1960s. So in that way, understanding this difference, I think, is extremely important to understand both the Bretton Woods system at the time, but also current view on the monetary system, international monetary system, both in his economic perspective, but also political perspective. And I think here there are two interpretations of the divergence between the view of Charles Kindleberger and the views of Robert Triffin. So just a reminder, because you were quite brief on that, Perry, but Triffin was famously arguing that there was a fatal dilemma in the Bretton Woods system, because if the United States wanted to provide enough dollars to the world, because for fueling the world with enough dollar liquidity, then since augmenting the dollars in proportion as a share of the US gold reserves will create a fall in the confidence of the dollar. That was the Triffin dilemma. And Kindleberger's, opposed to that, said, no, the US and the international monetary system is no longer constrained by gold, because the bankers in the world, the way that the system is really functioning does not care about the gold to dollar ratio. So he says the US is a world banker, is already providing all this liquidity, and you don't need to care longer about the gold reserves of the US. So there were very two different views of the issues facing the international monetary system in the 1950s. So so you see clearly that Kindleberger, in that sense, I'm not surprised that Perry was interested in Kindleberger, because he's really like, foreseeing what is happening after in Bretton Woods, and foreseeing the money views and how the money views understand the swap line today, the role of the US as an international lender of last resort. All of this was clearly in the mind of Kindleberger, both when he was writing in the 60s and also the way he interprets the swap line of the 60s in his book on the financial history of Europe that you mentioned. So now to interpret that. So you could say that Kindleberger was a genius. He had really understood very early the functioning of the system and the quite unlimited demand for US dollars. So that's a way to say that he has understood things that Triffin had not. And the other interpretation that also some scholars are endorsing was to say that actually Triffin, although he had an education and working in the US, was a Belgian economist. So he did not lack this kind of dollar hegemony. And I think it's still something which is important to discuss here, because it's an ambiguity that remains and always remains in the view of Kindleberger on what was then called the hegemonic stability. So it's true that it's better for the world financially to have the US providing enough liquidity to the whole world. But what are the political consequences of that? And I think on this, Kindleberger was quite clear. I mean, he lacked the Marshall Plan. He was disappointing when he sees in the 1980s the US retreating from the world. for understanding the world. So he believed a lot in US hegemony, and he even thought that it could be replaced in some ways the multilateralism of the IMF and so on. So my main question, Perry, is to have your thought on this. Is in what way a financial hegemonic stability is also politically sustainable, and what could be also the detrimental consequences of that? Thank you.
Do you want me to respond, or you want to take questions from the floor, or what's the procedure, Jay?
Perry, I think it would be great if you just now engage with the comments first for a couple minutes, okay, and then we'll open it up to everybody else.
Yes, well, all of these matters are dealt with in the book. Okay, so I will give you a sneak preview, I guess. It's not possible to here go through in detail, but let me maybe start because these set of comments are similar to each other. They come at from different angles. So one way to think about this is, yes, back in 1944, okay, there was Bretton Woods, okay, and Bretton Woods grew up as like, well, that was the momentous occasion when the wise men and politicians and finance ministers from every country in the world went up to this resort hotel in New Hampshire and they hashed it out and they designed the international monetary system. Okay. And that's what Triffin thought. Okay. He was apparently there in some minor capacity. He wasn't a negotiator. He was a junior person. And he was so impressed by that. And he thought that was it. And so when the IMF was created, that was going to be the new world central bank. And he was very disappointed that that's not actually what happened. What happened was the emergence of the dollar system from the private sector, from exactly this practice that Céline was pointing out. So that you use the word men versus circumstances. So we had both men and circumstances. You know, the men, and they were mostly men, were at Bretton Woods, and they wrote things on paper, and they celebrated this international act that looked like multilateralism and everything. And then the world got on with creating this hierarchical system with the dollar at the top. Okay. In fact, this is what Charlie thought, the world had been going that way anyway. That's why I bring up the tripartite agreement. You know, that it'd been going that way before World War II, okay, and World War II was a hiccup, a big hiccup, okay, but it started, and what he thought was going to happen was that basically London was going to turn into New York, or rather New York was going to turn into London, that the sterling standard, the gold standard of the sterling period was actually a sterling standard in the first place. And so we're emerging this dollar standard to replace the sterling standard. That's the big picture that he's imagining is happening. And he's imagining that this is happening in a Darwinian evolutionary sort of way. So it's going to happen whether we try to make it happen or not, okay? It might be helpful that we see the course of history and stop fighting it, okay? Which is what he was concerned about people like Triffin, you know, that they are a problem, you know, because they're getting their political masters to do stuff that is causing problems for this evolution. I mentioned John H. Williams, okay? John H. Williams testified to Congress against ratifying Bretton Woods. Why? Because he thought the idea of a multilateral currency system was crazy, okay? That we really needed to start by stabilizing the dollar against sterling, as we had done in 36, you know? And basically, that's what we did. We did that too. You know, there was this big loan, the Anglo-American loan, and eventually, you know, so in fact, as a matter of practical advice, John H. Williams was sort of borne out. That's what happened. We got the dollar system. And Charlie was on that side, okay? In fact, when Charlie, in that famous Economist article, where he says a minority view, everyone knows this, with Salant and Dupre, 1966, he says a minority view. When Williams was testifying to Congress, he referred to himself as having a minority view. Okay, so this is the money view. This is the money view that is always having a problem getting heard by the politicians, getting heard by the economists. But it's not hard getting heard by the bankers, and they just go along and create this system because it makes sense. So it makes sense economically. The problem is it doesn't make much sense politically. Now, every sovereign wants to be sovereign, okay, and therefore equal to all the other sovereigns, and that's what Bretton Woods kind of let them pretend they were. I had my honeymoon there in the room that was the finance minister of Venezuela, okay, and it was not the same place the Keynes was staying, okay, so not everyone was equal at the resort, you know, but they were all there anyway, and they voted for this. So governance is a problem, and the politics is a problem. Charlie never used the word hegemonic stability. Let's just be clear. I want everyone to appreciate that. I've read everything that he's ever written. He only used the word hegemonic stability, I think, when he was referring to other people who had used it. Okay, he did not promote that word at all. That was the political scientists who did that, and in some ways they caused misinterpretation of what he was about. He thought that providing the global currency was a public good. This was something the US was doing at some cost to itself, okay, for the world, okay. Not exorbitant privilege. I'm speaking here to two French discussants, okay, that this was not exorbitant privilege. This was, in fact, a duty, okay, city on a hill, America taking the leadership. And of course, after the war, that was easy because America was the economy left standing. It had basically armed and supplied the Allies and been victorious. And so that was not so hard. It was not so hard to say what's good for the world is good for America in 1944. You know, it is a little harder now, and there is this conflict. Okay, these foreign exchange swaps are where you see the rubber hit the road, and so it's very interesting to compare the global financial crisis with the COVID crisis in this regard. The global financial crisis, when the bazooka, $700 billion that the Treasury Secretary asked from Congress, and they said no, okay? The very next day, the Fed's balance sheet blew up by $700 billion, okay? So they were lending to foreign central banks to keep those mortgages in Europe until we can figure out what to do, okay? And that kept the international monetary system from collapsing. But Ben Bernanke was called before Congress and asked about that. It was a political problem. Who gave you the right to lend taxpayers' money to these bankers abroad? And he kind of just punted on that question. But there you see it. There's the political question. Here in COVID, no one has asked any questions about the expansion of the foreign exchange swaps. The fact that the foreign exchange swaps are kind of permanent, once the Fed announced, and the BIS has, they're very, I think it was BIS Bulletin number 1 or something, they point to this and they said the very first time, the Fed just had to say, oh, by the way, we're actually willing to stabilize the foreign exchange swap market big time. So the gaps, the basis went closed right up. So we are managing this global dollar system through this consortium of central banks and these central bank liquidity swaps. You know, it's not much, okay, compared to the list of things that Charlie wanted to do in the world in depression, you know, market of last resort and all that stuff, okay. But it is quite astonishing. It's a lot more than he would have imagined would be possible. So I think don't despair. It seems that organically we are building institutions of global governance. They are little by little from experience, and maybe it's a little bit of a race. And that dilemma of sort of the hierarchy of money is global, not just domestic. Okay, that's one of the things that is not in the MOOC. Okay, is the international hierarchy of money. The key currencies ideas, not in the MOOC. The political economy dimensions of that, not in the MOOC. You know, all these things that we've just been talking, none of that's in the MOOC. And it took me a long time to learn that. I kept saying, Charlie wasn't at Bretton Woods. How terrible. Then I realized he wasn't at Bretton Woods because Bretton Woods wasn't important in his mind, okay? He was in Germany, okay? He was reconstructing Europe, you know? That's what was important. Bretton Woods was for political purposes, not for economic purposes. Anyway, so I've rambled a bit here, but thank you very much. You've given me lots of, the reason I agreed to do this was I thought, not just to give you a sneak preview of the book, but to get a sneak preview of the response to the book. So I can try to make clear what my argument is and not be misinterpreted. So thank you very much.
Well, great. Just as a quick interlude, I've posted a poll into the chat that I encourage you to fill out and that we will be discussing during our icebreaker. It's about which Money View concept has most stuck with you since taking the course. But with that, I can't resist but to call on Bob Macaulay, perhaps also Professor Catherine Tcheng to come on, because we don't have the privilege to have them with us every day. Bob, do you have any thoughts on, since you've worked at the BIS, I think it's a very particular institution that is not very well known, maybe some insights on Kindleberger and Perry's remarks would be very welcome, if you like.
In answer to Eric, something that Perry already mentioned, but maybe went by a little quickly, Charlie wanted to have, I think he said, a German on the Board of Governors, or on the FOMC, I should say. And so he understood, I think, better than most, that there is a problem between the global domain of the dollar and the Washington Beltway. And he wanted to extend that Beltway across the Atlantic in order to make the governance of the dollar system as big as the global domain of the dollar. And if that had happened, we probably would have avoided the mistakes of Arthur Burns and the great inflation of the 1970s. And we wouldn't have had all the dollar, Deutschmark, dollar yen movements that ensued in the kind of currency instability and incoherence that we've experienced. So I think Charlie was not a sort of happy hegemon. If you read Harry Magdoff and Paul Sweezy's reaction to the 1966 article, it's like, here's the representative of hyper-imperialism. And the funny thing is, they're all FDR New Dealers. How can this be? But Charlie was serious about the global governance of the dollar.
Yes.
I wonder if I could come in and just, there's a couple of things I wanted to say. The first one is, you're talking a lot about men, and for those women out there, I think one of the people that should be brought into the discussion is Susan Strange. And while not an academic economist, certainly a very important journalist at the time, very close to the markets, and had really important ideas about the hierarchies of currencies and these sorts of aspects in the political economy, and was writing at the same time, pardon me, as Kindleberger's book on the Great Depression about the decline of sterling and international money. So I'd just like to insert that. And I guess I haven't taken the MOOC, but my view about the Bretton Woods and the rise of the dollar and the decline of sterling is quite different from what's kind of been discussed so far. I see Bretton Woods dying in 1947. And one of the things that has been kind of skated over is the real intensity of the post-war situation for promoting the role of the dollar, the persistence of exchange controls, that Anglo-American loan that you mentioned in 1945. Two of the conditions of getting that loan, one of them was accepting the Bretton Woods protocols for Britain, and the other one was making sterling convertible to US dollars within a year. And this really crushed the international monetary system as it had been devised at Bretton Woods. When you were saying that Bretton Woods is all about politics, and that wasn't why Charles Kindleberger wasn't there, I'd say that Bretton Woods was also about trade, that the motivation for having a multilateral convertible payment system was about allowing multilateral trade on a non-discriminatory basis. So if you see the driving force of the State Department in particular in driving that and tracing it right back to the Atlantic Charter between Churchill and Roosevelt. So sort of abstracting the monetary solution away from the trade solution, I think, is a bit ahistorical.
Super interesting. We'll get Perry's reaction in a second, but we have Inaki who has his hand up.
Thanks, Jay, and thanks, Perry, for a very interesting talk. So I want to come back on some tone that I noted in some of the answers and some of the speeches you gave, that there is this sort of inevitability, this sort of path dictated by some Darwinian evolution, and the direction is sort of set. And to what extent, maybe we'll find it there in the book, but to what extent does Charlie Kindleberger offer some hints on or pointers of how to navigate towards that destination in a context of more stability, and not like hold our breath until the last minute to see if a swap line will be forthcoming or not, for instance, just for an example. I mean, there has to be something that we can do. There is no, I don't think, and you, it doesn't strike me that you have a pessimistic view on this, but if the course is set, then, okay, how to navigate, how to make the navigation a bit easier.
So yes, so I mean, I'm speaking rapidly in response. So I may let me maybe I overstate some things. The idea is not that the course is set. Okay. In fact, quite the reverse. You know, that would be an equilibrium view of the world or something. He did not have an equilibrium view of the world. He viewed this as that what we're doing. What markets are doing, what every individual is doing, is searching, you know, for possible future paths that are workable. And you go in one direction, then you discover that's not workable, and so that collapses and it backs off. And that the system, in fact, evolves through crisis, through fluctuation. That it's not an equilibrium system at all. And so it definitely can use some help. You know, he's a big lender of last resort guy, right? So it's Darwinian evolution in the sense that it's not guided either. You know, and it could use some guidance. Okay, so he was eager to do that. Let me respond to Professor Schenk a little bit too. I think it's exactly right. So I don't mean to be ahistorical. Maybe that's a compliment for an economist, but I don't consider it a compliment. So I will let me respond to that terrible insult. Okay, that I think that's right. That Bretton Woods, they were concerned about trade, and in fact, the American manufacturers were concerned about trade. They had won a lot of markets during World War II, and they wanted to keep them and not have Britain go back and they wanted to smash the Commonwealth. Yeah, I mean, yes, all of that. There was a lot of trade politics that was driving what was going on there, and free trade was an attempt to exert U.S. manufacturing interests over British. Okay, I think that's right. Okay, but what I would point to, okay, which is Charlie pointed to, is they were imagining a world of free trade of goods. Okay, but where every country was allowed to have very severe capital controls, you know, so that there's not free trade of capital or money at all. Okay, because they had a notion that the Great Depression had been caused by the instability of the global monetary system and the global capital system. So they were imagining a world that was in fact, you know, every little sovereignty trading with every other little sovereignty, you know, that and just trade, X equals M on average, you know. And Charlie thought that would be terrible. And he thought that would be terrible, particularly for the third world, okay? That we need to restore capital markets, long-term capital markets, in particular, from the north to the south. I didn't mention, he wrote a textbook on development economics. What makes an international economist write a textbook on development economics? It's because of international capital flows, okay? That he thought were really key. He wrote all this stuff on the international, multinational corporation. That also got him into trouble with his lefty friends, that he thought this might be an agent for global, not global reach, you know, the famous book, but global capital flows or global interest, not just narrow national interest. The cosmopolitan interest was what he was always trying to push for. And so he was happy when global capital flows started again, and unhappy when US politicians put on the interest equalization tax and all kinds of barriers to letting New York grow up as the center of global capital markets. The American politicians didn't want that. And so we got the Eurodollar system instead. Okay. That's in the book, all of that, so it's an alternative history of international monetary system, right, that I'm telling here. It's about that the Bretton Woods happened for some reason, but it imagined a world that was quite different from the world that then evolved. And it's looking at this from a monetary point of view, not from a trade point of view. Okay, and seeing that the system, this is the money view idea. The system is essentially a financial system. It's not essentially a commodity producing system, okay? And so you're looking at it as a money flow operation from the get-go. And nobody was thinking that way after World War II. Remember, it was all politics. That it was the relationship between governments that was getting all these war goods flowing around. This was not a market system, and people forgot. But Charlie didn't forget. He remembered. He grew up in the 20s. He's a pre-World War II sensibility, and dropped into a post-World War II environment. And so that's a difficult thing to manage. And he was optimistic. You mentioned my optimism. He just decided to be optimistic, I think. Having survived World War II, having survived the Great Depression, what's to be pessimistic about? That's pretty good. That's pretty good. So, and he was very happy to be a teacher and sit on his butt at MIT and write books. He'd had enough adventure for a lifetime, in the war and in the State Department. He basically ran the Marshall Plan legislation in Washington, D.C. So he was very inside. He was an insider in that world, and he was an insider in the OSS before the CIA. He got in trouble with it. I have his FBI file. Anyway, all of this is going to be in the book. I'm not, I want to be a historian. Catherine, I want you to invite me to give talks.
Sorry, I wasn't giving the big insults that you were thinking of. I guess as a historian, maybe, I just think all that kind of historical detail matters. And I know you're trying to be revisionist and draw back into thinking about the monetary relations as being important in this period. But I guess I'm just wondering how revisionist it really is. But
well, I have used archives. I have used archives. So.
Yeah, but you need to use historians. So.
Yes. Well, it is definitely a book of an economist. This is, and it follows. It will. So probably the historians will be discontent. I leave a lot of the detail on the cutting room floor in order to make a large argument in a few pages, and that will lead to satisfaction. But that means that there's lots of outtakes to be published afterwards. And that's what I did with Lombard Street. That's what I did with Fisher Black, and that will happen here too. I got 10 years worth of outtakes. So. But thank you very much. I'm really honored that you would come and engage this. This is very helpful, and I will have this in mind in the final revision. Watch out for those historians. Yeah.
Well, I think this is a very good closing note. I, again, want to thank everybody.